All right. Hey guys, this is Miss Ramsey, and today we're going to be talking about lesson 5.3. So, this is unit 5, the Roaring Twenties, and this is still part of lesson 1, conflict over values, and this is a continuation. So, please pick up where you left off at the end of 5.2. We were just talking about eugenics, which was the terrible practice of believing that you could literally breed a better human being, which was pretty disturbing and led to some pretty nasty state laws, including forced sterilization, operations like hysterectomies to remove a person's reproductive organs if they were deemed undesirable. And remember, these are things like the Nazis over in Germany really took notice of, and they were happening here in the United States by progressives. I'm sure they had good intent, but remember, there was a lot of racism and nativism at this time in the 1920s due to unrest caused by World War One. The labor strikes, you had the race riots, all of these things producing this kind of society where fear and paranoia ruled the day. That's characteristic of like this first Red Scare era. And going along with this, I want to talk about the Scopes monkey trial. John Scopes was a substitute science teacher, a PE teacher really, in Tennessee. And Tennessee, like much of the South at this time, including our great state of Texas, uh, had a lot of laws restricting the teachings of science in the classroom, including specifically the teachings of Charles Darwin, evolution theory. Now, we've talked about social Darwin, which is kind of a pseudoscientific fringe offset of evolution. Evolution theory in general is the belief that mankind, along with other animals and plants, have adapted over time through, like survival of the fittest and other things that over the millennia, these adaptations have resulted in the changes to where we now are today. Like man came from monkeys from long, long, long ago. Horses came from much smaller animals, and over time we've changed and adapted the survival of the fittest. So that's evolution theory, and it is something that you get taught today. In your science class. Usually it's like freshman year, I believe biology, you guys have it. But back at this time in the 1920s, as society was changing so much, especially in the cities, and as new technologies were coming about and new ways in which people were interacting, many people felt threatened that the world around them was changing so quickly. And so, especially in the South, where it's much more conservative, conservatism means like you don't really want things to change. That's where that word comes from. The southern states had passed laws that restricted the teachings of science and evolution. So that's where this trial really begins. And this substitute science teacher, John Scopes, he was approached by a civil rights group to basically kind of test the law, the Butler Act, it was called, that restricted the teaching of evolution theory. And so when he was substituting at this school, he basically had the students get out their science books and turn to the page in evolution. He started reading from it and became a test case, and purposely basically got himself arrested to go to this trial. Now, also, the city of Dayton, Tennessee, the city leaders also wanted a big, flashy, glitzy trial to attract a lot of publicity. Their city had kind of been on a downturn the last many years, where their businesses were not doing so great. The economy was not great. So a big, flashy trial about something that really gets people very fired up. Should we be teaching evolution theory? Or the counter to it, should we be teaching about religion and creationism? That's the idea, like from the Bible, that God created the universe. What should we be teaching in our schools? And so this is a very, very, divisive, trial basically, and it was going to attract a lot of money, as all these reporters and everybody else came to hear this trial in their little city there in Tennessee. So that was another reason why this happened there at this time. This was in 1925, and the main lawyer for the prosecution, going and prosecuting Mr. John Scopes for teaching evolution theory in the classroom, was none other than William Jennings Bryan, the celebrated populist. Remember, he ran as a populist. Boom, boom, ba, bum, bum, ba, da, ba, 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 bum. Those are those farmers. Remember, they had the 16th and 17th Amendment. William Jennings Bryan, he ran as a populist Democrat in 1896 and lost to McKinley. He ran again and lost again in 1900, again to McKinley. And just for funsies, he ran a third time in 1908 and lost once again. But William Jennings Bryan is a great populist. He is beloved by the people. He is also a devout Christian, and he's a very celebrated American. I remember he'd probably touched more lives and seen and met more people than anybody else of this era. He's very famous. And he is the prosecution. He's the lawyer going and prosecuting this case. So he's on the side of religion. He's on the side saying that evolution should not be taught in schools, that it goes against our Bible, because in the Bible it says God created man. Man didn't come from monkeys. So that's the side that he's on. And you might also, for the test, remember that this side that is all about the Bible is what we call like fundamentalism. It's not just that you are a Christian and you're religious, it's that you have a very strict view and interpretation on the Bible, that the Bible should be read literally, like all the stories in it and all of the things that are described, every word of it, if you are a fundamentalist, is real. That's a literal, very strict interpretation of the Bible, and so that's called fundamentalism. That's also kind of the traditional or like the old school belief um, side of this case that we're looking at. So the other side, the defense, the defense lawyer that was defending John Scopes and defending basically evolution theory, but also science in general, and in a broader sense, modernity. Modernity is like modernism, the idea that we want to move forward with technology and into the future. We want to use science. That side is Clarence Darrow. He is a very famous defense attorney, and so Darrow is the defense, famous William Jennings Bryan is the prosecution, and they're going to basically make this a giant circus in Dayton, Tennessee. And during the trial, the judge, this is a Southern, Tennessee judge there, he throws out most of the evidence that Darrow brings forward. So Darrow tries to prove evolution by showing, fossils and other like pieces of evidence that would prove evolution to be true based on Darwin's findings and everything. But that all gets ruled as inadmissible to the case. The judge won't allow any of that actual evidence. And so Darrow's kind of stymied until he has a stroke of brilliance, and he basically calls up to the witness stand none other than his opposing attorney, the prosecution's William Jennings Bryan. This famous American titan is basically going to take the witness stand, and Darrow cross-examines him. He questions him, and Bryan, he does know his Bible very well, but the way Darrow asks the questions, it's not that the Bible isn't real. It's just that you can't make logical sense of it if you try to have a strict fundamentalist view on it. Okay. And what I mean by that is Darrow asks like, okay, how old is the earth? And then Bryan goes on, according to the Bible, that it's, the God created the earth in 7 days and all of this. And Darrow basically points out that, well, there's fossil and carbon dating evidence that show that, there's rocks and trees that are older than. How do you explain that? And the thing is that Bryan can't explain it, because you can't explain the Bible and its many mysteries and revelations and stories and metaphors, because it's not really meant to be taken literally. If you're trying to put reason and science in it, those things don't exist in it. The Bible isn't based on those things. The Bible is based on faith. And so Darrow kind of makes Bryan, who at this time is a very old man. This is 1925, once again. He makes Bryan look kind of like a fool, trying to literally explain the Bible in this fundamentalist interpretation. And at the end of it, the judge will rule against John Scopes and fine that teacher $100 for teaching evolution. And you might be thinking, What was this all for then? Why did we spend, however long talking about this, the miss, if it was all about being fined $100? Well, it was more than just, was this science teacher guilty of violating the Butler Act? Yes, the judge said he was, and he got fined. That was the case. But the attention that this brought, the reporters, they aired this whole trial and all of the cross examinations and the witness testimony and the evidence and everything that was allowed from the lawyers. It was all aired on the radio, which radio in the 1920s was starting to become a really big form of media. That was the way that people were getting their news and getting their entertainment. And so the nation kind of tuned in to this trial. It was the trial of the century. Which was going to prevail? Was it going to be science and the future moving forward using technology, modernity, modernism, or was it going to be looking to the past? Should we go back to the old way and not change so much? Should we still hold on to our old belief systems, this fundamentalist view on the Bible and religion? It was about these two opposing viewpoints and which would prevail. And for that goes beyond what a judge rules. That was into each family's home for them to decide for themselves what they thought the winner would be, who they thought the winner was. And that's still the case to this day. Yes, we do see technology and science being the way that we have moved forward, but there are still many in America. I mean, especially now, you can see this strain of conservative fundamentalism. You can see it very evident. There are those that cling to the past, and not that there's anything especially wrong with that, but it is something that has divided Americans for a very long time. It's important to understand this divide between fundamentalism and modernity. That all kind of goes back to this Scopes trial, the famous monkey trial. And here you can see, hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. Basically, evolution is guilty. It's saying that science was on trial. That was the case. And here's just a few pictures from it. You could see in this political cartoon that Tennessee is snuffing out this candlestick of knowledge, basically by saying they don't want to have science be taught in their classrooms. So they want to go back to, I mean, you could follow the metaphor through, right? They want to go back to the dark ages. Let there be darkness, because the light of knowledge is going to be gone. Let's see. Headquarters for the Anti-Evolution League, the conflict, hell in the high school. Yeah, they really don't want to have these views that contradict the Bible and their Christian beliefs being taught to their children in schools. That was where this all originated from. There is a lovely video. All right. Let's talk about another conflict that was shaping society in the 1920s, the roaring 20s. It was roaring for the cars. It was roaring for some good happy times and dance crazes like the Lindy, and it was roaring for all the bad stuff that was happening that we're talking about in this lesson. So the 18th Amendment is prohibition. It basically made it to where you are not able to produce, sell, or consume alcohol. So alcohol was basically prohibited. It was made illegal. That is why the 18th Amendment is called prohibition. And there were many reasons for this. This goes back to like the 18th century reform efforts from the Second Great Awakening, when many women and women's groups championed against alcohol with the rising temperance movement, because alcohol was seen as a moral sin. It was seen as a thing that caused depravity in society and led to husbands coming home drunk, beating their wives, beating their children, neglecting their family. And don't forget that women didn't have control of their finances. So that was another element at play as well, that if your husband is squandering all of your family's money at the saloon or the tavern or the bar, then you can't do anything about it. The woman was not in control of her own money. And so that was one big element at play. And there were various women's groups that campaigned for decades to get alcohol banned in America. Famously, this was like Frances Williard's Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. But there was also other large groups like the Anti-Saloon League. In addition to these temperance movements and reform efforts, There was also World War I that contributed to the passage of the 18th Amendment. Remember that there are major stereotypes against Germans and German Americans that they drink too much beer. And so it was seen as unpatriotic to be consuming or producing alcohol during World War I. A, it was, seeming like you're supporting the Germans, and B, also, it was seen as wasteful when those grains could better be used to feed our troops. So that was another element here for prohibition. And then finally, economically, financially, prohibition, the 18th Amendment, was not possible until after the ratification of the 16th Amendment. Remember the populists? Remember we got the 16th and 17th Amendment from those we are farmers, from those guys, the People's Party. Well, the 16th Amendment was the graduated income tax. What it did was, established a tax for the more you make, the more you have to pay. The less you make, the less you pay in taxes. Well, since the government was now getting tax revenue from the people's income, it no longer had to rely on excise taxes on liquor. It was getting that money from the 16th. So now it was free to basically go ahead and ban alcohol. And that's what happened. Right after World War I, this amendment finally gets ratified. And the era from 1919, after the 18th Amendment passed, up until it will be repealed or gotten rid of with the 21st Amendment. You got to be how old to drink again? 21? Oh, yeah. That's a great way to remember the amendment that's going to bring alcohol back to America legally, 21st Amendment. That passes in 1933. So this era between that, roughly encompassing the Roaring 20s, the decade of the 1920s, is called Prohibition, when alcohol was prohibited. And it's defined by a giant rise in crime, because even though alcohol, or at least its production, sales and consumption were made illegal, that ain't going to stop Americans from drinking. In fact, the opposite was true. So you can't tell Americans what to do. So there will actually be more Americans drinking during Prohibition than had drank before it was made illegal. And some of the various types of crime you'll see will be like bootleggers. Bootlegger was somebody who would illegally smuggle alcohol into a city for sale. And bootleggers, this was major enterprises that became huge endeavors and led to like the creation of the mafia. This is where you got criminal leaders like Al Capone, giant gangster rings, running cities like Chicago and others. Bootlegging, usually they would bring in the home brewed and alcohol that was made still for medicinal purposes. They would smuggle it in cars and vehicles. The original name bootlegger, though, was for the small time smugglers who would had like, many amputees from World War I had hollow, wooden legs or prosthetics. And so they would smuggle booze in their hollow legs. But that was a small time. These big gangster rings, they had huge operations, and like Al Capone, this was millions of dollars in this smuggling industry. A speakeasy was a hidden bar, and it was called speakeasy because you were supposed to be very quiet about the password to get in. Because remember, bars and saloons, taverns, they all had to kind of shut down or turn into restaurants. But oftentimes, these establishments would build like a secret basement or a back room that was hidden, maybe behind, a wall or a cellar door or some kind of, barrier to keep it hidden. And then you'd have to give the password to get in. So whatever it was, hey, Muggsy, it's me. But you get in there, and that was a hidden bar in the cities, these speakeasies. And then organized crime, like I said, the rise of the mafia. There they are at the beginning of Prohibition, throwing a giant barrel of all that beer down into the sewer. And here is a very large speakeasy, and you can see the crowd getting very wild, people listening to the new jazz music of the day. Many, even average Americans, ignored the 18th Amendment. It was just so hard for the federal government to enforce it. They ended up having what was called prohibition agents that were tasked with trying to curb, violations of the prohibition. But oftentimes these agents were corrupt, or they were bought off. It didn't work out very well, and that's eventually why we're going to repeal or get rid of the 18th Amendment. And the only way to get rid of a constitutional amendment is to create a new amendment, and that's why we have the 21st. Also, so the government could get some delicious tax money from it during the Great Depression. Here you see like a temperance woman, a conservative religious woman. She's smashing open a saloon. Here's again a temperance cartoon. Here's a World War I propaganda poster, basically campaigning against beer. Here's another one too, also showing like the beer kegs is like Germans. The Huns were the Germans. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about in this lesson is the changing role of women. And that basically, remember, the 19th Amendment had just passed in 1920. And so like the presidential election of 1920 was the first time that women could vote. Women are feeling more liberated in American society than they ever have in the past, because now they can actually vote. They had just, many of them, gotten outside the houses and worked, independently in very usually male-dominated jobs, such as working in factories because of World War I. You'd had various women's groups like Alice Paul's National Women's Party doing things out in the open, such as civil rights protests, hunger strikes in prison, campaigning with the posters and everything. And so all of these things are going to factor into women in the 20s and how they behaved. And especially for young urban women, they started to reject social norms, because typically women in society were supposed to be seen and not heard. They were supposed to be quiet, docile. They were supposed to be very modest, which meant, they were supposed to have most of their skin covered. And these women that were a product of the 19th Amendment, giving women suffrage, giving women the right to vote, feeling empowered from having independent work in factories during World War I, and all these changes, these young women, they became known as flappers because they rejected all that. They said, if I want to go out and have a good time at night, I don't need a man to escort me. I don't need to, have my father's permission. I don't need a chaperone. And they would go out and they would party. They would drink, which was illegal because of prohibition, so they were extra risque. They would smoke as well, which during the war, cigarettes were known as freedom sticks. And so they was seen as very liberating, very freeing for a woman to smoke and drink, and basically also have the appearance of somebody new. Basically, she would, a flapper, one of these young women who was basically living her life to the fullest and being a lot more free than her mom's generation, she would cut her hair very short, like the bob cuts. She would also, you can see like here, and see, yeah, here's very typical like flapper haircut right here. Okay. She would also wear clothing that was much less restrictive than in previous generations. So gone was the corset that was very constricting. That's that, rough plated fabric you would have over your bust and your stomach that would be tied and very, very compressed, almost like crushing your ribs. That would be thrown out, and instead these women would have very kind of loose fitted clothing. Their legs would be showing, like, maybe up to the knee. Gasp, shock, right? Their wrists would sometimes be showing, maybe even their whole arm, if you can believe how scandalous that was. Goodness sake. And so they were much more free. They even wore makeup. Like I said, they smoked, they drank, they went out in society and had a good time. They went to the speakeasies. I went to the speakeasies and they drank some illegal beer. And many of these flappers also tried to pursue new opportunities in the workforce that previously women had never been able to try to get. They started to become, office workers and secretaries. I know that seems like, oh, that's what women typically did, but remember, for the most part, no. Only poor women worked. In the 1800s, if you were middle class or wealthy, it was the woman's place to stay in the house. And these flappers, they didn't want to stay in the house. They wanted to go out and live their lives. So this was a new, different kind of woman, and that was the flapper. And it's called flapper because like their clothing was, it was loose. There's their dancing, famous dances of the 20s. Look at me, I'm dancing crazy. They did the Lindy, they did the Charleston, all these dances that were very required a lot of movement too. So it made sense their clothing needed to be less restrictive. All right. And we will talk more about the flappers, but I hope you got a good sense for kind of who they were. And also in this lesson about, um, you know, conflict over values, how these women, not acting like appropriate, modest, conservative women would threaten many of these, more fundamentalist, traditionalist conservatives, like we saw with the Scopes trial. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. Make sure to do your summary. That is the end of lesson 1 of unit 5. So please remember to answer that EQ, and I will talk to you later. Bye.